Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into something pretty major happening in global trade. It's all about these potential new fees the U.S. is looking at and starting to implement on ships built over in China.
Yeah, and this isn't just a small adjustment, is it? It's got the potential to send, ripples right through global supply chains, international relations. It's a big one. We're going to try and cut through some of that complexity today.
Exactly. We want to give our listeners the essential insights. Whether you're tracking economics, supply chains, or just geopolitical shifts, this matters. We've gone through a ton of news reports, industry analysis, expert takes to bring this all together. Our mission really is to understand these proposed fees, look at the potential impacts, the domino effect, maybe across different sectors, and, explore the different arguments around it.
Sounds good. So where do we start? What's the spark?
Right, the genesis, what kicked this whole thing off.
Well, fundamentally, it boils down to the U.S. wanting to rely less on China's shipbuilding industry. I mean, the numbers are stark. China accounted for something like 44% of global shipbuilding output in 2023. Huge share.
44%. Wow.
Yeah. And tied to that is the goal of trying to, revitalize the U.S. shipbuilding sector, which, as many listeners probably know, is heavily focused on naval contracts these days, not so much commercial shipbuilding.
Okay, so reducing dependence, boosting the domestic industry. Wasn't there also a national security angle? I remember reading about an investigation.
Absolutely. That's a crucial piece. The Biden administration launched an investigation specifically looking into whether China's dominance in shipbuilding poses a threat to U.S. national security.
And this wasn't entirely out of the blue, right? Didn't the previous administration have similar concerns?
That's right. You had the Trump administration's Make Shipbuilding Great Again initiative. So this concern about the state of U.S. shipbuilding and competition with China, it's been building for some time.
Okay, so a brewing concern. But how did we get from that general worry to these specific fee proposals? What did that process look like?
Well, the initial talk was pretty dramatic. There was a proposal floating around about fees potentially hitting $1.5 million per port call.
Whoa, $1.5 million per stop.
Per stop, yeah. As you can imagine, the shipping industry reacted quite strongly. A lot of backlash.
I bet. So that initial idea got scrapped or changed.
It got revised significantly. They moved away from that per port call idea to something a bit more, structured differently.
Okay, so what's the current structure then? How are the fees calculated now?
So the proposal now is based either on the ship's net tonnage, which is basically a measure of its cargo carrying capacity, or in some cases per container being carried. And importantly, it's applied per voyage, not per port call.
Per voyage, okay. And what are the actual numbers looking like?
Let's break it down. For ships that are Chinese-owned, Chinese-operated, and built in China, the starting fee is proposed at $50 per net ton.
$50 per ton.
But here's the kicker. It's set to increase by $30 per ton each year for 3 years.
$30 a year increase. That adds up incredibly fast.
It really does. Then you have ships that were built in China but are owned by non-Chinese companies.
Right. What are those?
For those, the fee starts lower. It's $18 per net ton or $120 per container, whichever's higher. And the annual increase is smaller too, just $5 per ton per year.
Okay, still an increase, but less aggressive.
Yeah.
Any other categories?
Yes, there's a specific one for vehicle carriers. Those are the big roll-off ships, carrying cars. If they weren't built in the U.S., the proposed fee is $150 per vehicle they're carrying.
$150 per car. Got it. And you mentioned a limit. It's not applied every time they visit.
Correct. It's applied once per voyage and only up to a maximum of 6 times in a calendar year. So frequent visitors get a bit of a cap.
Okay. And any other future changes planned?
Yeah. Looking further out, there are plans for restrictions on LNG carriers, liquefied natural gas carriers. The idea seems to be a long-term, phased approach to encourage using U.S.-built ships for LNG transport.
Interesting. So a very targeted set of fees, clearly designed to influence behavior. What are the potential consequences, though, particularly for U.S. ports and the whole logistics chain?
That's a massive area of concern. Think about major ports like Los Angeles and Long Beach. They already struggle with congestion, right? They handle about 40% of U.S. container traffic.
Yeah, bottlenecks are almost the norm sometimes.
Exactly. So the fear is if ships start diverting to avoid these fees, where do they go? And could that make existing congestion even worse at the ports they do choose?
Where might they divert to?
Well, analysis points towards maybe Canadian ports like Vancouver or Prince Rupert, or maybe Mexican ports like Ensenada. You could also see more traffic heading to U.S. East Coast or Gulf Coast ports.
But can those other ports handle a big surge? Do they have the infrastructure?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's real concern about whether these alternative ports are actually equipped for a significant influx of traffic.
And wasn't the original fear with the per port call fee that it would actually concentrate traffic, making ships stop fewer times?
Precisely. The American Association of Port Authorities, the AAPA, they specifically warned about that. They worried it would drive traffic to the biggest ports and potentially cause smaller ports to, well, lose significant business. Shifting to per-voyage fees was partly meant to address that specific issue.
Okay, so rerouting, potential congestion shifts.
Yeah.
What about the direct cost implications? Shipping rates, consumer prices.
Yeah, the consensus in the industry is that shipping rates are going to go up. Estimates are hovering around, say, 10 to 15%.
10 to 15% increase. That's not insignificant.
Not at all. And some companies are sounding louder alarms. Atlantic Container Line, ACL, they put out a statement basically saying costs could increase dramatically for imports and exports. They even suggested it could force them to terminate their U.S. service entirely.
Wow. Terminating service. That's serious. And what does this mean for, regular folks buying things?
Well, ultimately, higher shipping costs almost inevitably mean higher prices for consumer goods. It gets passed down the chain. McKinsey did an estimate suggesting these fees could cost the U.S. logistics industry over $2 billion a year.
$2 billion. So how do logistics companies cope with that kind of hit?
They'll be looking at everything. Raising their own fees to customers, definitely. Trying to renegotiate contracts, maybe even reducing operations or services in some areas. It could be particularly tough for smaller operators, the ones with thinner margins. You might see more market consolidation.
Squeezing out the smaller players, potentially. And what about the ships themselves? Will companies change where they buy new vessels?
That seems very likely. The expectation is a definite shift away from Chinese shipyards. Companies will likely look more towards yards in South Korea, Japan, maybe Europe. Those countries represent about 40% of global output combined.
But if everyone rushes to those other shipyards?
Exactly. Increased demand there could just push up prices at those yards too. So it's not necessarily a simple fix cost-wise.
It really is a complex web. Okay, zooming out a bit, how does all this potentially impact global supply chains more broadly? Trade patterns.
Well, if you have shifting routes and more potential for congestion, that probably means longer lead times for goods. That hits things like just-in-time inventory systems pretty hard.
So companies might need bigger buffers.
Yeah, you could see more investment in local warehousing, maybe better tracking technology to keep tabs on things, and definitely holding more buffer stock just in case.
And the ships themselves. If they're built in China, does their value change in the charter market?
There's definitely concern about that. Will charters be hesitant to take on a China-built ship because of these potential U.S. fees and access issues? It could make them less appealing. And overall, there are worries this could have a net negative impact on the U.S. economy, maybe even hurting U.S. exports if costs go up too much.
Okay, we've covered a lot of the potential downsides and complexities. But what are the arguments for these fees? Who supports this and why?
The main proponents circle back to those initial goals we talked about. Reviving U.S. shipbuilding, reducing that strategic reliance on China. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office is pushing this line. You also see support from labor unions, steelworkers, machinists who see potential for more domestic jobs, and some Democratic members of Congress are behind it too.
So national security, domestic industry, jobs. What about the counter-arguments from the opposition? They seem pretty strong.
They are. Groups like the International Chamber of Shipping and the Chamber of Shipping of America are warning about, potentially catastrophic effects on U.S. trade and consumer prices. A really key point they hammer home is that U.S. shipbuilding capacity just isn't there right now to pick up the slack. They argue these fees won't magically revitalize the sector.
They think other measures are needed.
Right. Many argue you need more proactive legislation, maybe direct investment, not just punitive fees. There's also concern from ports themselves, like Seaport Manatee, and retailers via the National Retail Federation, that this will just hurt American businesses.
Oh, and another angle is cargo diversion to land potentially more trucks on the road, leading to congestion at land borders.
So a real split in perspectives on the likely outcomes. What has China said about all this?
Predictably, China's reaction has been strongly critical. They argue the fees will harm international trade across the board,
Yeah.
raise global shipping costs, and disrupt supply chains everyone relies on. Their foreign ministry specifically warned they'd take, quote, necessary steps to protect China's commercial interests.
Necessary steps. Sounds like potential retaliation could be on the table. Now, you mentioned some changes from the initial proposal. Were there specific exemptions put in place? Yes. After that initial industry pushback, some modifications were made. There are key exemptions now. For example, ships just moving goods between U.S. ports are exempt. Same for ships going to Caribbean islands or U.S. territories. Also, American and Canadian vessels operating solely within the Great Lakes. And interestingly, empty ships coming in just to load U.S. exports are also exempt.
Okay, so some specific carve-outs. Anything else?
There's a provision where foreign ro-ro carriers, those vehicle carriers, again, can actually get refunds on the fees if they place orders for new vessels to be built in the U.S.
A direct incentive to use U.S. shipyards.
Exactly. And of course, the big shift we already discussed, moving from per port call to per voyage fees.
Given all this uncertainty and these potential changes, what are logistics companies likely doing strategically right now?
You'd expect them to be actively looking at diversifying their routes and the ports they use, trying to build flexibility, maybe forming more strategic alliances or partnerships to share risk and potentially costs. Definitely considering fleet diversification, investing in non-Chinese built ships over the longer term might look more attractive now. And probably accelerating adoption of tech for better tracking, visibility, and efficiency gains to offset potential cost increases.
Makes sense. Okay, final piece here. Stepping back. How does this fit into the bigger geopolitical picture between the U.S. and China?
Well, it's clearly happening against a backdrop of, let's say, heightened trade tensions. It's part of that ongoing dynamic involving tariffs, trade imbalances, strategic competition. And we've seen before how trade actions can ripple out. Remember when U.S. tariffs led some ships to divert to European ports, causing congestion over there in the U.K. and EU?
Right. Unintended consequences are always a risk.
Exactly. So this isn't happening in a vacuum. It's another move on that complex chessboard of global trade and politics.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. To summarize for everyone listening, these proposed U.S. port fees on Chinese-built ships are, well, incredibly complex. They have the potential for really significant disruption across shipping, logistics, impacting costs, trade routes, supply chain efficiency.
Yeah, the stated goals are clear: boosting U.S. shipbuilding, addressing national security concerns, reducing reliance on China. But the opposition is fierce, warning about negative economic impacts, questioning if it will even work to revive the U.S. industry.
So it leaves us with some big questions. As these fees potentially come into effect, how will they reshape the global flow of goods? What unforeseen consequences might pop up for businesses, for consumers?
And maybe a deeper question: are fees the best tool here? What other strategies, perhaps beyond just fees, might be more effective in the long run for actually strengthening the U.S. maritime sector in a sustainable way? Definitely a lot to keep an eye on as the situation develops.